Exclusively on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I'm your host, Callie Wright, and today we are talking about the F word, the super, super dirty, bad, awful F word that destroys comment sections and friendships and lives all around the world. We're talking about feminism today, and I have two guests who are people that I have lots and lots of respect for. I have Greta Christina, who's an author and a blogger. Her latest book is Comforting Thoughts on Death That Have Nothing to Do with God, right? Said that right?
Comforting thoughts about death that have nothing to do with God. Yes, that's it.
Sweet. Okay. And I also have Tracie Harris, who is a speaker and regular co-host of the Atheist Experience. Welcome to both of you.
Hey, thank you.
Oh, thanks so much.
So the first and most important question I want to ask, and we can start with either of you, is when did you start hating men?
And God,
I've hated men since
God.
I was born. I came out of the womb hating men. Insert sarcasm note, I don't hate men. I have many men in my life who I'm very close to and who I love very dearly. Do not hate men. That's a myth.
So in all seriousness, I think feminism gets a bad rap sometimes, because there are people who claim the label who are extremists, just like, with every other group. And then, on the other side, I think it's because a lot of times people just don't want to admit privilege, that other dirty word that gets thrown around by SJWs. Greta, let's start with you. What are your just sort of general thoughts on that sort of interplay, especially within the atheist movement?
But which interplay? Which interplay are you talking about exactly?
Well, the idea that people give feminism a bad name because of extremists and people who say that we don't need men, and there are people who say who wear the misandrist label with pride and who really are sort of hateful and extreme about it. And then there's also the other side where people strawman reasonable feminism because they don't want to admit privilege, or they don't want to recognize that there's another group in society who may not have it quite as good as they do.
Well, I think that it's much more the second than the first. I mean, of course, there's a handful of people in any group that are bad. It's like, you take any group of people, football players, people who play bridge, feminists, Democrats, Republicans, any group of people. And you can find people in that group who are terrible and have terrible ideas. But what's interesting to me is that it's marginalized people who get tagged with the behavior of the most terrible people in it. It's not even the most extreme people, it's just the most terrible people. It's marginalized people who are expected to take responsibility for the most terrible people in their group. And it's marginalized people who are, who get tagged with that. And I think it's really important to remember that there are people who, not necessarily consciously, but there are people who have a vested interest in making feminism look bad. There are people who get a lot of good stuff, insert rant about privilege. There are people who get a lot of good stuff, a lot of advantages from the status quo, which is very sexist. And that includes, it's obviously mostly men, also, women who are kind of tagging themselves into the sexist power structure. And I think that is really, really important to remember that it's almost any time you hear one of these extreme myths about what feminists think or say or do, it's really important to remember, if that's true at all, and sometimes the myths are just completely made up. It's things like, it's like people say that all men are rapists. Well, a fictional character in one book written in the 70s said that. So yes, by all means, let's, paint all of feminism with this fictional character in a book. It's really important to remember that these myths are perpetrated by people who don't want to deal with what feminism really is, because dealing with what feminism really is, A, again, means giving up privilege, and B, it means accepting some really harsh realities about how the world is. Once you recognize the reality of any kind of ism, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, etc., once you start really recognizing and accepting these realities, it's a lot. You have to acknowledge the reality of a lot of suffering in the world, a lot of brutality in the world, a lot of cruelty in the world, and you have to start looking at what responsibility you have for it. So a lot of people don't want to do that. I don't think it's a conscious decision for most people, but a lot of people don't want to do that, have a vested interest in not doing that, and so therefore, again, I don't think it's always a conscious process, but pass on these mythologies about what feminism is because they don't want to deal with what feminism really is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tracie, what are your thoughts?
I agree with pretty much everything she said. And one of the things, just a couple observations on that is when Greta was listing the types of groups, like the demographics, and saying every demographic has its, people in it that are not good people. One of the groups that I wanted to point out or add is atheists. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I want to add that is because a lot of the arguments that are put forward that are anti-feminist arguments are also arguments that are put forward against atheists. So I one time was dogging this guy on a sub-thread at a comment thread, and every time he posted an anti-feminism point, I posted the equivalent anti-atheist point. And I said,
awesome.
And what I did was I said, oh, I know what you mean. It's so frustrating. I get that all the time too. People tell me that about atheists too, and then I would give an example. And one of the things, talking specifically about, people, they'll give these whacked out quotes that are attributed to somebody that's an active self-identified feminist. And you know how many quotes you can provide from activist atheists that are completely whacked out and just off the rails? There's no end of it. And yet, if somebody were to say, hey, you're responsible for everything this atheist over here is spouting, we would be like, no, we're not. Not at all. And we would resent that as atheists. But somehow it's okay to do that to another group, and that's not a problem. It's how do you resent the fact that someone does this to you as an atheist and then you go and do this to feminists?
Absolutely. So I think maybe we should spend a minute or two here defining, what we mean by feminism, because I think, there's definitely a diversity of thought among people who identify themselves as feminists, and, some of it's little stuff and some of it's big stuff. There's a group of people who call themselves feminists who are very anti-trans or, anti-sex worker or, those kinds of various things. So, when we talk about feminism, how exactly do either of you actually define feminism and what specifically it means?
Tracie, do you want to take this first, or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. First? I can go first because mine is very brief.
Okay, go.
I was introduced to it with Beth and her podcast, Godless Bitches, and she always used the definition gender equity. And when I would look it up, very often that's the definition that was used, and so I just went with that. I tend to think of it in terms of gender equity.
And Greta?
So I would say that that's certainly the core of it is, there's a famous saying that feminism is the radical idea that women are people.
Right.
And I think the core of it is, equality of sexes, equality of opportunity, equality of, how we're treated, equality of, just and that includes obvious things like economic equality, pay equality, and so on. And it also means equality in terms of things like representation in media, equality in terms of, how our safety and, is taken seriously or not, equality in terms of bodily autonomy. And equality doesn't necessarily mean the same. It doesn't necessarily mean treating absolutely everybody the same and, we just pretend that we're all gray, identical pod people. It doesn't mean that. But it does mean, treating people as equals and to the best of our ability, treating people as individuals. And I think that's for me, that's a lot of the core of it is not pushing people into rigid gender roles and rigid gender expectations. And that includes women. It includes men. There's a lot of really sexist and unfair and harmful gender expectations of men. I don't think they're as harmful as those of women, but they are serious and they're no joke. And of course, gender expectations of people who are not on a gender binary, who are expected to be in a gender binary. So that's a longer answer. I would say, if I had to shorten it up, I would say feminism is the recognition that sexism exists, the recognition that sexism, that discrimination and inequality on the basis of gender exists, is real, is a thing, is a bad thing, and the commitment to do something about it.
Yeah, and I think that's, you brought up an important point there, because you said that feminism is about recognizing that sexism exists. And so my next question was actually going to be, you very often hear the argument, why don't we call ourselves egalitarians, or why don't we just call ourselves humanists, because it's inclusive of all people. So what's your response to that?
Well, let's see. My initial response to that is a stream of incoherent cursing, which I won't necessarily regale your listeners with. My response to that is that, yes, there are unfair gender roles and gender expectations for men, but it's much worse for women. The reality is that, gender expectations and gender roles and gender inequality does hurt women much more than it does men in a documented way. And I think let's just call it humanism. Well, first of all, humanism means something else. Humanism has a meaning, and it isn't this. And I think that it's important to acknowledge when we're talking about gender inequality that it's important to understand the history and the reality that gender inequality does mostly fall on women. And also, to some extent, I really hate the quibbling about language, and we see this again in the atheist movement, people insisting that this is what atheism really means, this is what humanism really means. And of course, they want everybody to define the word the way they do. And, if you hear about the reality of sexism, of misogyny, of, insert long list of ways that women are just crapped on, every minute of every hour of every day of every year, and your biggest complaint is you don't like the word, then you have a serious problem with your priorities.
Well said. Tracie, what do you think?
I've actually been collecting a list of bullet points here. Can I kind of start with this and go back? Because there were other observations on things that Greta had brought up that I also wanted to make that I thought were good points. So first of all, the point that she's making about quibbling over the label, right? Again, this is a thing that atheism deals with. You get these people who say, why do you continue to call yourself atheist when it has such baggage with it, when it's got all these negative associations, and it's such a negative term, and it's a responsive and reaction type of a term? Why don't you pick a better label, or why don't you go with something that's less, got less baggage? I mean, we hear that all the time as atheists. And so it cracks me up the way that we'll have atheists using these same arguments that they reject when it's used about them, at every single point. And then when you talk about addressing specific segments, why would you not just have this blanket egalitarian label, or some kind of a label that has to do with human equity or whatever you want to call it? And the point of that is that you always, and there's very few movements that don't break down into subsections that deal with specific problems within the blanket movement, right? So I don't think there's many people that would be against overall human equity. But I think that there's no problem in my mind with somebody, for example, that comes out of a community in Black America saying, I have to address prejudice against my community as a Black person in America or in the US. And so I work on that particular part of the puzzle. Yeah, the whole puzzle is about human equity, but this is my niche. This is the thing that affects me and affects my community the most. And so this is where I put my efforts, and we coordinate around combating. And it seems like if you really believed in equity for human beings, that you would just simply embrace all those movements as positive parts of that effort, instead of rejecting them all and saying that they all have to just focus on some homogenous perspective of human equity. And we can't face the reality that there's racism and sexism and, ableism and all these different things that constitute problems for an equal society. Like, why the heck would you be averse to somebody saying, well, let's break it down into manageable chunks and address it that way?
Well, yeah,
I mean, to me, that's just common sense.
One of my favorite things to do when people say something like that is, I think to myself, like, okay, I'm pretty involved in the atheist community. I'm pretty involved in LGBT activism, and just doing those two things is exhausting. So my response sarcastically is like, wow, you must be exhausted solving literally all of the world's problems. Yeah. What sort of activism do you actually do?
Famous sayings like think globally, act locally. And I think another way of looking at that is, think big, do what you can. Think big, act, think generally, act specifically. Yes, obviously, human inequality is a bad thing. But if you try to address, how are you going to address that other than just saying kumbaya
without addressing what's going on?
And whenever I hear sort of this argument against, you shouldn't use the word feminism because if you're saying that feminism includes discrimination against men, then it's the wrong word. It's like the people who were saying when they hear Black Lives Matter, respond with all lives matter. It's like, can for 5 minutes this not be about you?
Yeah, it's exactly
it's
that.
Like the entire freaking world has been about, straight, white, able-bodied, middle-class, college-educated, cisgendered American men. Did I miss anything in there?
No, I think you got it.
Centuries. Can we please have a conversation for a little while about women, about Black people and other people of color, about trans people, and so on? And it feels like an attempt to deflect. It feels like an attempt to derail the conversation. It's like we're talking about women. Well, why can't we talk about men for a change? Right, because we never do that. We're talking about Black people and Black lives and how Black lives matter. Well, why can't we say that all lives matter? I think it was Arthur Chu responded to that on Twitter by saying, do you barge into cancer awareness marathons and say all diseases matter? You barge into a funeral and say all deaths matter. We care about things. We work on things one thing at a time. And I think your point about, if you're, working on just one or two things, even that's exhausting. And, and I do think that it's an attempt to derail. It's an attempt to distract, and it is once again an attempt to draw attention back to the privileged people who are very, very used to having it be about them. And I want to say I'm being harsh here, and I have every reason to be harsh, but I'll also say that I have some sympathy because, let's talk here about axes of privilege, axes, I don't know the plural there. So there's lots of ways in which I am a marginalized person. I'm a woman, I'm queer, I'm mentally ill, I have depression, I'm fat, I'm kinky, I'm poly. There's all these ways in which I'm marginalized, and there's all these ways that I'm privileged. I'm white, middle class, college educated, relatively able-bodied except for the depression, American. And I do get that, when there's conversations about race, and I as a white person am shutting up and listening. Or I as a white person am listening to criticism of something that I've said or done and being really uncomfortable and trying really hard to not argue and make it all about myself as opposed to the harm that I did by the thing that I said or did. When you're very used to it being about you, there is this uncomfortable awkwardness in letting it be about somebody else for a while. It is difficult, and I have some sympathy for it, but I don't have a lot of sympathy for it. My sympathy runs out pretty quick.
Right. And Tracie, we kind of interrupted the middle of your...
No, that's all right. I mean, it's an organic conversation. I'm good with that. But there was another point that Greta had made previously when we were talking about defining feminism. And one of the things that is really important is she called out that, it's not about everybody being homogenous, everyone being the same. That's not the same as equity. And so, like, you have this issue of equal rights in the United States. You have equal rights regardless of your status, like in the theory anyway. And the point isn't that you only have equal rights if you're not in a wheelchair. Because if you can't walk and I can walk, then you don't get the same rights as me. That would be ridiculous. And so a lot of times it's so ridiculous to me that I can't believe that it even has to be responded to, but it ties in with the idea of thinking of yourself as like the normal thing and everybody else as the other, is that I a lot of times encounter people who interpret gender equity as everyone has to be a man then. And it's like, no, you're not getting it, right? Gender equity means that you look at me and you understand that I am worthy of equity based on who I am, not based on the fact that I have to be you, right? I don't have to become you in order to be equal, just like somebody doesn't have to get operating legs in order to be equal, because if you can't walk clearly, you're not equal, so you don't get equal rights. It's like, no, that's not how it works. It's not what equity and equality are about. It's about saying that it doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair. It doesn't matter if you can walk. It doesn't matter if you have a uterus. It doesn't matter if you have a penis. It doesn't matter if you're dark-skinned or light-skinned or whatever. It doesn't matter. We should all be respected based on who and what we are, not the idea that we're going to all be measured against what Greta just pretty much defined as the standard privileged person. That is not, we have to get out of this mode of thinking of that as the standard and everything else has to become that in order to be equal. It's like, no. And I have had people, like, especially real, it's so ridiculous to me, but they'll talk about like physical strength or physical size. And they'll say, like, when you can bench press 250 pounds, you can be equal. And I'm like, yeah, because every guy can bench press 250, right? There's no guys that can't. But the other thing is, when you can, gestate a fetus for 9 months, then you can be equal. How about that? Yeah. Right. So, I mean, it's this idea that you don't just say that because you're incapable of something that I'm capable of, you cannot therefore be even thinking of equity. It's like that in itself is like the problem, right? That's the problem in a nutshell right there, is not respecting other people based on who they are and judging everybody by your standard. And saying that
off of that, I'm listening to you say it's like, well, if you can bench press 250 pounds and you can be equal. It's like, how often do you have to bench press 250 pounds in your life?
Exactly.
How many jobs are there in the world? There are some jobs in which you have to have extreme physical strength. And yes, on average, men have more, if you look at the bell curves, men's bell curve of physical strength peaks somewhat higher than women. And some of that actually does have to do with culture and, ways that women are not trained, don't get as good physical education in school and so on. But some of it does have to do with, just size and so on. And so, fine. So if you're, deciding who's going to be on your professional football team, if you're deciding who's going to be on your professional basketball team, probably in a completely egalitarian world where absolutely everybody had equal opportunity, there would still probably be more men than women on those teams, but there'll probably be some women. There are some very freaking strong, large women in the world who are bigger and stronger than the men who are currently in, the NBA or the NFL or whatever. And that's, I think we're kind of getting into here this question that's tricky and interesting and complicated of, is there any inborn difference between women and men? Not counting physical strength and size. Is there any inborn difference in terms of, psychology, emotion, intellectual capability, and so on? And I actually think this is not an easy question to answer. If you look at other animal species, there seem to be some behavioral differences between males and females. And, it's not completely implausible that there is with humans. But I think it's important to remember that even if there are, let's concede that there are, which I don't really concede, but let's concede that there are some inborn differences in terms of, ability to be, social, ability to have spatial relations, ability to think analytically, whatever. What we're looking at, if that's true, is overlapping bell curves. We're looking at situations where, men on average would be somewhat more this, that, and the other. Women might, on average, might be more this, that, or the other. But what we don't, and so it's like if you're looking at, jobs where, for instance, like say teaching or nursing, you might see, if there really is some sort of innate female tendency to be more nurturing because we're the bearers of children, early cisgender women are the bearers of children. Cisgender women who choose to have children are the bearers of children. That doesn't mean that there aren't men who are nurturing and loving of children and patient and with good social skills. And, this tendency for instance, teaching to be a female job, I think that we would see a lot, we might in a perfectly egalitarian world see maybe 60-40 split, in some of these jobs, but we wouldn't see the extreme gender split that we do now. And I think very importantly, something that's important to notice is jobs that tend to be dominated by women for whatever reason, for mostly, I think, historical reasons and reasons of discrimination and so on, rigid gender roles. Jobs that women tend to be in tend to pay less. And very importantly, once that starts to change, once women start to enter a field, the pay scale goes down. Once men start to enter a field, the pay scale goes up. And that's something that's really important to remember. It's, you look at, it was only very recently that in professional tennis, the prize money for both women and men became the same. And women had to I think it was Venus Williams, really spearheaded in more recent years. And other women had spearheaded it for a long time before her, but had to really fight for that. And it's like, you're still winning a tennis match. Why is it that, but this is this thing to remember when we're looking at the question of, is there any natural tendency for women and men to sort themselves into different jobs or different activities? It's really important to remember that a huge amount of this sorting, even if a small amount of it is, quote, innate, a huge amount of it is social, and it benefits men.
I, Olga Kay.
I, Michael Buckley.
I, Kat Graham.
I, Timothy De La Ghetto.
I, Chris Cluey.
I, Issa Rae.
I, Lucas Cruikshank.
I, Hannah Hart.
I, Shira Lazar.
I, Brendan Iambadejo.
I, Chester C.
I, Davey Wavy.
I, Margaret Cho.
I, Philip DeFranco.
I, Scott Hoyne.
And I, Mitch Grassi.
Pledge to.
Pledge to.
Pledge to.
Pledge to let my friends know that they can talk to me.
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 Be respectful and supportive of everyone.
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 Regardless of sexual orientation.
Or gender identity.
To listen.
Listen.
Listen with an open mind.
And without judgment.
Without judgment.
Without judgment.
Take what people say.
Take what people say
seriously.
Seriously.
Take what people say seriously.
Check in with friends.
With friends.
Check in with friends who may need to talk.
Who may need to talk.
Help a friend call the Trevor Lifeline.
Help a friend call the Trevor Lifeline.
Help a friend call the Trevor Lifeline if they are in crisis.
If they are in crisis.
866
488
7386.
Tell a person I trust.
I trust.
I trust.
Tell a person I trust.
If I think someone is considering suicide.
If I think someone is considering suicide.
To call the Trevor Lifeline.
Call the Trevor Lifeline.
Call the Trevor Lifeline.
Whenever I need support.
Whenever I need support.
Whenever I need support.
866-488.
7386.
Join us and make the pledge today. Go to trevortalktome.org and share with your friends.
Here's an excerpt from Callie's audio journal, produced exclusively for patrons of the Gaytheist Manifesto.
A few weeks ago, I was in the throes of one of these fits of wallowing in my shame and regret, and something just started to feel different. Instead of wallowing, it felt more like mourning. And I started to think about it, and I realized that what I was experiencing that night wasn't wallowing, it was catharsis. I suddenly began to feel like I was letting go of that shame and regret. I was mourning for the time that I'd lost instead of just feeling sorry for myself. I was grieving that time so I could finally move on from it. And when it was over with, I felt ready.
For access to this and more, join the movement. Go to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to learn more.
Let's kind of shift topics here for a second. Tracie, I'm going to give you a crack at this one because I think Greta's going to have a whole lot to say about this one.
Okay.
Recently, the news was making the rounds about this interview that Jermaine Greer did, where basically she said, trans women aren't women, and anyone who knows a lot about her knows that she's had far less kind things to say about trans people that won't necessarily fit on a PG-13 show. But sort of give me your thoughts on that brand of feminism, of trans-exclusive feminism.
I don't understand it. I just don't understand it. I don't even know what else to say about it. To me, it doesn't make any sense. I don't get where it's coming from. I would think that, to me, it's like a natural inclusion, and to make it like exclusive, I just don't know why somebody would do it. It'd almost be like if you had the atheist community and somebody said, "I don't think we should embrace the black atheists." I would be like, "Why?"
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, I actually have some insight onto where it comes from, and this is by no means excusing it, because it's terrible, 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 terrible. And I think where it comes from is a lot of where the trans-exclusive feminism comes from is the second wave feminism that is very attached to the idea that gender roles are entirely 100% socialized. This is this thing we were talking about before. If you are of the opinion that gender roles and gender identity is 100% just this thing that's learned, you're going to be very resistant to people who say, look, I was born with male genitals, I was treated as male, I was socialized as male for my entire life, and yet I nevertheless, despite that socialization, see myself as female. That throws the whole idea that gender identity is 100% learned, it dumps it in the trash. Now, my response to that is the theory is not the most important thing. People are the most important thing. If people's experiences, people's lived experience is the most important thing. And if you have a feminist theory that demands that you reject the lived experience and the lived reality of trans women, your theory needs to be revised or dumped.
Yeah, I agree. And
so I think that, so I think, again, we're talking about where does it come from? That's where it comes from in second wave, 60s, 70s feminism, that's kind of where that originated, although there's still plenty of second wave feminists around now, a lot of that theory is, its foundation is this idea that gender is entirely learned. And if they are to question that or accept the existence of trans people, they're going to have to do a whole lot of rethinking of the foundations of their feminist thinking, and they don't want to do that. And they see that as anti-feminist. They think that what feminism means isn't gender equity. It isn't rigid gender roles, whatever. It's their idea of what feminism means is that feminism is the understanding that gender is taught and learned. So to them, it seems anti-feminist. I think they're full of crap. I think they're 100% full of crap. Again, if your theory contradicts the lived reality of people's lives, as well as a significant amount of scientific research on, the existence and validity of trans identity, your theory needs to go. But you're asking where it comes from, and I think that's where it comes from.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, and obviously, I mean, I'm younger. I turned 31 next month, so I wasn't around for that whole thing. So I don't think I'm as up and educated on that era as I should be. But I mean, the idea itself seems very sexist to me, because it means that you are literally defining yourself by your genitalia, which is like kind of the idea that you're trying to fight against in the first place, right?
You'd think.
I don't know.
Yep. Don't have anything to add to that. Tracy, you have anything to add to that?
No, I still have bullet points from the past, though. Am I going to be annoying if I keep bringing those up?
No, please do. Please do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because Greta had brought up the idea of, people being defined by the worst people in their demographic, right? It's so true. Like, you take the worst people in the demographic that you are, for whatever reason, railing against, and you use the worst examples, and you say this represents your group. And it's horrible. It's like a horrible, horrible mode of argumentation. But what's funny is your group is always excluded from that, right? Like the group that you're affiliated with is never subjected to the worst. Those are always different and something wrong, and that's an aberration, and that's the no true Scotsman, right? They're not a real whatever I am.
Yep.
And the one that made me laugh was recently I was railing a little bit about, the gun debates, because they had all those shootings in the news, which is not unusual anymore, sadly. And one of my friends brought up that, there's been a lot, because I was like, we need to get a dialogue on track for what's actually going on here. Something is wrong with the country. It's not, this is not about like keeping guns away from, people with mental records. And this is not about taking all the guns away. There's too many other examples around the world of systems that work differently, and they're not as violent, and they don't have, and they've got like all these mixed metrics. So it's something wrong with us as a culture. And she was like, oh yeah, she's like, there's tons of literature if you want to look it up on like, the male masculinity roles and how that feeds into violence in the US. She's like, this is not like a new concept. And if you're really interested, that's what you want to look for. So I started looking into it. And one of the things that was really funny to me is the demographics around like mass shooters, which are predominantly like in a huge way, white men. And yet, you hear some, I've heard some off jokes about it, but we don't ever really align that demographic with that violence, right? In a way that is just like making them own it in the way that like racism makes blacks, for example, own crime.
I was just about to say that.
Right? Yeah. It's like you have some people in your demographic that we know, like who doesn't have criminals in their demographic, right? But it's like you have people that are criminals in your demographic, and I see this on TV shows all the time. And so, we're going to associate blacks with criminals. But it's like, okay, so how many shooters have we seen that have been white dudes? But we don't go around saying every white dude is a mass shooter waiting to happen. But it's just kind of an interesting thing how they are like immune to owning the negative things that are predominantly white and male. And I'm not saying that they should have to own it. I'm saying nobody else should have to own the worst of the worst in their group either.
Well, yeah, it's just pointing out the double standard.
Both of you, and it has to do with that, because what this is making me think of is when extreme. Let's talk about religion and atheism. When extremist, Muslim terrorists do terrorist things, or when extremist Christians, when extreme Christian radicals do terrible things, a lot of times. Atheists, or actually anybody who's not in that group, anybody asks Muslims to do this, and atheists ask Christians and everybody else to do it. Say, you need to take response, say to the moderates who are trying to disavow that, you need to take some responsibility, and at the very least, you need to speak out against this. You need to say this, this is not us. This, we think this is terrible. You need to take responsibility for the worst of your group, at the very least, to, the kind of responsibility that involves, speaking out against it and disavowing it and saying, and I think this plays out very differently for identities that in some sense we choose, like, religious affiliation or, political affiliation, as opposed to identities that we're born with, like race or gender.
Right.
But so how does that play into that? How does the idea that
I see it as different because
it's ridiculous to make people take responsibility for the worst of their demographic, and that this is something that mostly marginalized people get, piled on? Because you're right. It's like I'm starting to see a little bit of pointing out, hey, these shooters are almost always white men. What's that about? Right. But it's true that nobody's saying, therefore, men are to be feared.
Right.
But so how does that play into this idea that, at least with chosen identities, we have some responsibility, and I feel that as an atheist, I do feel when some horrible atheist, when Richard Dawkins is saying some other sexist, racist thing, I feel a need, not to say not all atheists, but to say, what?
I think I understand your question.
I understand that he doesn't speak for all of us.
Right. The answer that I would give is that when these people are doing these things, they're doing it and claiming it as representatives of your group. And that's what makes you have to disavow it. When somebody when somebody that happens to be black goes in and robs a convenience store, they're not saying, I'm doing this as a black person to make a statement as a black person. This is just some kid committing a crime. But when somebody gets up and says, I'm doing this because Allah demands it, and you worship Allah, you had better stand up and say, that's not my understanding of what Allah demands. Right? That's your obligation. And if somebody gets up, if Dawkins gets up and says some stupid shit, but it's not as an atheist rep, like if he embarrassed himself in some biology paper, I wouldn't give a shit. But if Dawkins gets up and starts talking as an atheist and says something that's like, I'm just like, whoa, I don't agree with that, I'm going to say that's not my understanding of yes, that's not my position as an atheist.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I feel that compulsion, especially because, as a trans person, I'm relatively privileged. Like, I have a decent middle class job. I've got an apartment. I never have to worry about where my meals are coming from and that kind of stuff. And I do this activism all the time because, I'm not worried about survival. So I talk to, these kids who are in survival mode. They've been kicked out by their families. They've been crapped on repeatedly by society. They can't find a doctor or a psychologist that gives a shit. And then I talk to the rich, white, gay sort of LGBT aristocracy or whatever it is. And I feel stuck between those two. So like when one of those people says something silly, like I was at an event the other day and they were trying to sell, the ability to go to a party and kiss a 7-foot transsexual woman as a reason why you would want to give someone money so you can get to go do that crazy exotic thing. I have to say, they're not all like that. Many of them really care. And then I have to turn around to those kids and they're saying things like, I hate cis people. Cis people suck. And I have to be like, yeah, they're not all bad. So I feel that compulsion from both sides. And I think, your sort of analyzation of why that is, I think that's totally spot on.
Well, it's so, and I totally agree, and I think that's a very good analysis. I think it is sort of important to have it not go in the direction of not all men. It's like when,
exactly.
and I think to some extent, it's a difficult, nuanced line to walk. You hear about sexism, and men respond, but not all men are like that, and it's like, basically, it's again, it's a way of deflecting or derailing the conversation. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about it as like, well, this now has to be all about me and how I'm not a terrible person. That it's much more about acknowledging, yes, this is terrible. Some men do this. Some atheists do this. Some Muslims do this. But, and I want to have it be heard that I don't stand with that.
Get in on the conversation. Join us at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto.
Today in school, I learned a lot. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me. In English, I learned that I'm disgusting. And in physics, I learned that I'm a loser.
Today in school, I learned that I'm ugly and useless. And in gym, I learned that I'm pathetic and a joke. In history, I learned that I'm trash.
Today in school, I learned that I have no friends. In English, I learned that I make people sick. And at lunch, I learned that I sit on my own because I smell. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me.
In biology, I learned that I'm fat and stupid. And in math, I learned that I'm trash.
The only thing I didn't learn in school today?
The only thing I didn't learn today?
The only thing I didn't learn?
Is why no one ever helps.
Kids witness bullying every day. They want to help, but they don't know how. Teach them how to stop bullying and be more than a bystander at stopbullying.gov.
The next thing I'd like to talk about, and I'm sure this will be a fun discussion, is I want to talk about MRAs, men's rights activists, quote unquote, inverted commas. I read something really awesome about MRAs, and I was trying to find it a minute ago, and I couldn't. It was like a Tumblr post. Basically, they were talking about how men's rights activists. I mean, they wear the activist label because they put it in what they call themselves. But, you never see them, advocating for black men or trans men or queer men or poor men or disabled men. And you never see them really doing anything other than shouting down feminism. And
well, sometimes they rape apologize.
Right, that's fair enough. I missed that one part.
Yeah. You gotta give them snaps for what they do.
Right, exactly. So Tracie, talk to me about your experiences and your thoughts with that whole thing.
I think the best thing about the MRAs is that whenever I talk to just people that I run into and that comes up, they don't know what I'm talking about. And to me, that's the best thing about it,
yeah.
Is that it's extremely marginalized. I view them as like wolves howling in the wilderness. And
that's good. I like that.
Well, go howl. I mean, nobody understands it. And this, the men that I run into are kind of baffled by it. And that's in all walks of life. I'm not even talking about men that are within the atheist community, like guys that I run into that are just like all over the place. They have no idea what it is. They have a million questions about what in the hell is that? And, and I think the general consensus among people when they hear about it, and it's not like I'm saying horrible things like I just had said earlier, but like even when I say that it's a group of men who are advocating for men's rights. And I remember I have one friend, the most recent conversation that I had was with somebody that deals with federal law enforcement. He said, well, what rights do they think they don't have? And I'm like, you'd have to talk to them. I said, but they're kind of a confused group of people. I think that they're very marginal. I think that they're that it's kind of a good. They're right up there in my mind with the white rights kind of activism. It falls right in line with that. It's sort of we think of people doing white rights. You kind of have this idea of the backward protesters, right? That are all in Alabama or something like that. And not to diss Alabama. I'm sure there's good people in Alabama. There's, both of them are probably really nice. But then you've got the MRAs, which I think when people hear it, average person on the street hears it and they hear just even the brief definition of what it is, the bell that goes off is, oh, so this is like white rights, right? And it's like, yeah, pretty much that's what it is. It's like the sexist version of the racist protesters for white rights.
I basically agree with you, and certainly I agree that the equivalent, that it's absolutely like the, it's like, it has, the men's rights movement, air quote, has about, as much to do with the actual empowerment of men as, white power has to do with actually genuinely empowering white people and freeing them from, racial, whatever. Right. I wish I could be as sanguine about them. I agree that they're a small, marginal group, but I do think that they're influential, certainly when I'm engaging with just ordinary sexist guys on the internet. A lot of what they have is MRA talking points. It's that thing where the small, marginal group, then there's sort of the group around them that excuses them, that rationalizes them, that trivializes them. And the ideas do get out in, more modified, forms. But those ideas do get out. I run into MRA talking points all the time when I'm dealing with people who do not identify as MRAs and who even think that they're ridiculous and hateful.
Let me ask a question, though.
Is that the MRAs are largely responsible for the really ugly, terrifying harassment of women on the internet. They're the reason a lot of women don't do feminist activism anymore, have left feminist activism. They drive women off the internet pretty regularly. They are, when you hear about really hateful, ugly, violent harassment and threats against women online, that's mostly who you're seeing. And the other thing is that, we were talking earlier about mass murder and, sort of mass shootings. And one of the things I've been noticing is that in recent years, in mass shootings by white men, a lot of times they're MRAs. A lot of times it's MRA talking points or they belong to the organization. Elliot Rodgers, the most obvious example. This most recent, God, I'm blanking on the name because I'm terrible with names, but the most recent one, MRA. It's the most, I'm not going to, I do think that they're marginal, but I'm not going to dismiss them any more than black people dismiss the white power movement because, they're marginal, but they also still kill people.
Yeah. Tracie, you had a question?
Yeah. I do agree that they're sort of centralized online. Like their online presence seems to be basically their presence. I don't really run into them in the real world. And my question was, when you run into somebody in the real world who expresses these sort of marginal perspectives that are influenced by MRA thinking, my experience is that those people are easy to talk to and that I can dispel those myths really easily by simply having a reasoned conversation with them. And my question was going to be, do you have that same experience?
I wish I did. No, I'm going to say no, I don't.
Okay.
There's organization's putting it too large, is a group that I organize here in San Francisco. It's a social group called the Godless Perverts, and we're an atheist group that's interested in sexuality and gender. And we have social events and performance events and so on. And if you're in the Bay Area, you should come check us out. There's my little plug. But we have had to expel 3 different people from our group because they showed up. They were spouting these not quite MRA talking points, but borderline MRA talking points, sort of certainly very hardcore sexist talking points. And actually, in one case, it was definitely MRA talking points. And we're very stubborn about it. And, it's like we tried to talk with them. We tried to reason with them. We tried to explain why this was wrong and the history behind it. And we basically just had to kick them out. Unfortunately, no. And that's the thing is that I think it can be a little hard to draw a clear, bright line between MRA, hardcore anti-feminist, medium core anti-feminist, a person who just has pretty normal sexist ideas but is very stubbornly attached to them, like the people who get mad because Target isn't gendering their toys anymore. It's not necessarily that easy to draw a bright line between those categories.
And I had one other thing on the point about the shooters and the MRA attitude. That was, I think, kind of a portion of what I was reading, the recommended reading that was given to me. It's this idea of masculinity and the marginalized and threatened masculinity that is creating the anger that is, I don't want to say making this violence, but is kind of like what seems to be wrong with us as a culture that has left these people in a small area where they feel more and more squeezed, and they can't express these antiquated masculine modes anymore, and they feel like they can't be men, and they feel like the idea of a man is assertive and aggressive and physical. And so this comes out in rage and violence. So it makes sense that a group of disenfranchised males who feel their masculinity threatened by changes in the culture that are taking away their privilege, based on what our views of masculinity have been and how we pump that up, especially, the icons of masculinity in media all being like these really pumped up violent characters. When you start to encroach, that's going to come out. Well, it's almost like what we see with religious people getting more and more aggressive toward the atheist community. And when you see people like sexism, I mean, not sexism, but racism, when it was going down, you saw such anger and violence coming out of that group as those ideas and that lifeway started to crumble, right? I mean, people start flailing because they can't accept the change, and they want to hang on to what they consider to be theirs, and they feel that power slipping away, and it really threatens them. And so people lash out. And during civil rights, we saw horrendous violence, right? I mean, the images from that violence are really horrific. And what the papers that I was reading that were recommended to me were all talking about the idea of the same thing happening with regard to sexism as opposed to racism. And this is like the marginalized masculinity lashing out. And that's why it's these men that are doing this. But it would make sense because the MRA is the place for disgruntled males. So of course they're going to go there.
Yeah, and Tracie, will you send me that reading list? I'll put it in the show notes because I think that sounds like pretty interesting and relevant stuff.
Okay.
So
definitely. I would also love to see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I can do that.
So as we wrap up here, we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff and some not fun stuff and lots of things that are problematic. But Tracie, we'll start with you. Do you have are you hopeful? Are you seeing positive change? Obviously we know these problems are still big and they're still very big problems that need to be solved. But I mean, are you super hopeful? Are you optimistic that things are at least slowly inching in the right direction?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think right now what I'm seeing is like the crumbling. We're watching the GOP disintegrate in front of our faces, right?
Oh, God, yeah.
And we've got, if you could see the world that I saw when I was growing up in and look at the world now, it's like night and day. It is unbelievable how much things have changed. I mean, just what's accepted now that was not even mentioned when I was, 10 years old. You never even heard about it. No one, it was all hush hush and quiet, and you couldn't be, if somebody was a single mom, it was, scandalous, and if someone got a divorce, it was, family shame. And if somebody, people got pregnant, you sent them away. They'd go away somewhere. And I mean, things have changed so much. People now are doing the out and proud kind of, here's my story about my abortion. And it's like, wow, you would never have seen that when I was younger. I mean, things have changed so much, and I don't really see that stopping.
Very cool. What about you, Greta?
I am, let's say, cautiously optimistic or somewhat optimistic. Yes, I think that things have changed dramatically. I agree with everything that Tracie said about that. Things have changed about, we're living in a more feminist world, a more, gender egalitarian world. We're certainly living in a world that's better for LGBT people. We're living in a more, world that has more sexual liberation in good ways, more sexual information and so on. So yeah, I am optimistic, and I am not optimistic that we are going to quote unquote win. I don't expect to see an egalitarian utopia, certainly not in my lifetime. I think that it's going to be a long, hard fight. I think that it's going to be, fight by degrees. I do think that, people, again, get stuff out of privilege and, don't like to acknowledge that privilege exists, and will nevertheless fight tooth and nail to hang on to it because they get stuff from it. So I think that we're going to need to keep fighting. I think we also need to keep fighting, because if we don't keep fighting, we backslide. I think that we've seen that with, for instance, reproductive rights. We've seen backsliding in reproductive rights, and it's a thing where we're currently fighting to regain ground that we gained in the 70s. So I think that it's important to remember that this is, the struggle for an equal world is an ongoing struggle. It's, a struggle that's been going on for centuries. It's probably going to continue for centuries. And, human nature is what it is. People want to keep the things they have. People like power and money and stuff. And we all do, I like power and money and stuff. I also like having, human relationships with people and not having there be pointless suffering in the world. So I think that, I'm not optimistic about, reaching an egalitarian utopia. I am optimistic, and I'm not optimistic about ever being able to stop the fight. I am optimistic about things continuing to get better. I am optimistic that if we do continue to struggle and if we do continue to push, that things will continue to get better. Harm reduction. I am a big advocate of harm reduction. And when it comes to social justice and equality, I am hopeful about harm reduction.
I hear that. Well, ladies, this has been an amazing discussion. I want to thank you both, Greta Christina and Tracie Harris. Thank you so much for joining the show. Tracie, do you have anything you want to plug? Any place we can go to find more about you online, get in contact with you online?
Just, I'm with Atheist Community of Austin and the Atheist Experience. And you can watch us every Sunday at 4:30 to 5:30 about.
Very cool. And Greta?
You can find me at Greta Christina's blog, which is at freethoughtblogs.com/Greta. That's the best way to find all my things. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and I have books out. I have Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God. I have Coming Out Atheist, How to Do It, How to Help Each Other, and Why. I have Why Are You Atheists So Angry? 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless. And I also have my erotic fiction book, Bending Dirty Kinky Stories About Pain, Power, Religion, Unicorns, and More. All the books are available in print, ebook, and audiobook. If you like the dulcet sounds of my voice, I read the audiobooks. I did the voiceover for the audiobook. So yeah, all of those things.
Fantastic. Greta and Tracie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're so welcome. This has been awesome. And Tracie, thank you. I'm really glad to have a chance to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely nice to chat with you again.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to thank one more time my guests, Greta Christina and Tracie Harris, for a great conversation. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm at GaytheistCallie on Twitter, and you can find the show on Twitter at TheGaytheist. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.